Running an empire is tricky. You've got to balance profit, control, and pretending you're there for the local's own good. The British East India Company, a mega corporation with its own army, decided to streamline the process by simply taking over. They introduced something called the Doctrine of Lapse, which was a wonderfully corporate way of saying, if your king dies without a son, we get his kingdom. It was an inheritance scam on a national scale. They also annexed entire regions like Awadh, not because of a lapse, but just because they felt like it, leaving thousands of local aristocrats and soldiers suddenly unemployed and very, very annoyed. This created a delicate social structure of simmering resentment. So when rumors started about new rifle cartridges being greased with pig and cow fat, violating the core religious tenets of both Muslim and Hindu soldiers, it wasn't just a spark. It was a lit match thrown into a warehouse of gunpowder that the company had spent a century collecting. The opening act of this continental drama took place in Meerut on May 10, 1857. After 85 sepoys refused the new cartridges, their British commanders decided a public shaming was the appropriate HR response. These men, soldiers from high-caste families, were stripped of their uniforms and shackled in front of thousands of their comrades. A truly brilliant piece of man management. That evening, all hell broke loose. The enraged sepoys freed the prisoners, shot their British officers, and then the local population joined in, hunting down and killing any European they could find. The most amazing part? The senior British officers in Meerut, with the largest garrison in the region, did absolutely nothing. They were so paralyzed by shock that they just let the rebels march away down the road to the ancient capital of Delhi. Crisis response at its absolute finest. Every revolution needs a figurehead. The rebels arriving in Delhi decided to nominate Bahadur Shah Zafar II, the 82-year-old Mughal emperor. This sounds grand, except the Mughal Empire was basically a memory at this point. Zafar was a poet and a pensioner of the British, living in the Red Fort with zero actual power. Suddenly, his quiet retirement was interrupted by an armed mob proclaiming him Emperor of Hindustan. He was, to put it mildly, not enthusiastic. Imagine being forced to lead a massive, violent uprising when all you really want to do is work on your calligraphy. Yet, he became the symbol, a ghost of an old empire dragged out to bless a rebellion he couldn't control. Delhi fell into the rebels' hands, and for a moment, it seemed like the company's days were numbered. With Delhi secured, the violence took on a terrifyingly personal dimension. It wasn't just a military mutiny anymore. It was the eruption of a century of pent-up racial and cultural animosity. The initial targets were company officials, but the violence quickly metastasized, consuming British civilians, merchants, and even missionaries. Anyone with white skin was a symbol of the oppressive system. In one infamous incident, about 50 captured Europeans, mostly women and children, were held captive and then systematically executed in a courtyard near the Red Fort. This wasn't a calculated military tactic. This was raw, explosive rage. It was the horrifying logic of a people who felt they had nothing left to lose, turning the colonizers' own disregard for their lives right back at them. Meanwhile, in the city of Kanpur, now Kanpura, British garrison under General Wheeler found themselves besieged. Their defensive position was a hastily fortified ditch that was, charitably, a terrible choice. The man leading the siege was Nana Sahib, an Indian aristocrat whose massive inheritance and title had been snatched away by the British Doctrine of Lapse. He had a personal grudge. After 3 weeks of brutal siege, with heat, disease, and constant bombardment decimating the defenders, Nana Sahib made an offer. He promised safe passage down the river for all the British survivors, including hundreds of women and children, if they would just surrender the garrison. Trapped, starving, and desperate, they agreed. Because when a man you financially ruined offers you a deal, you can totally trust him. On June 27th, the British survivors were marched down to the Sati Chora Ghat on the banks of the Ganges River. They were loaded onto clumsy thatch-roofed boats, believing their ordeal was over. It was just beginning. As the last person boarded, a signal was given. Hidden cannons opened fire, and horsemen charged into the shallow water, slaughtering the men. It was a perfectly executed ambush. The boats were set on fire. Almost all the men were killed on the spot. Around 125 women and children who survived the initial massacre were rounded up and dragged back into the city as prisoners. This event transformed the British view of the rebellion from a dangerous mutiny into a battle against inhuman monsters. It was the point of no return. The captured women and children were imprisoned in a small villa called the Bibi Ghar, or House of the Ladies. For a few weeks they were held there. But as a British relief force approached Kanpur, their captors decided on a final, horrific solution. They sent sepoys in to kill the prisoners, but the soldiers balked at the task, firing their rifles into the ceiling. So, the rebels outsourced the job. They brought in local butchers, who went into the Bibi Ghar with knives and cleavers. The next morning, the bodies and the still living were thrown down a deep well in the courtyard. When the British troops finally arrived and saw what had happened, any talk of mercy or restraint evaporated. The rallying cry became, "Remember Kanpur," and it was a cry for vengeance. The British response to the massacres was not what one would call measured. It was a wave of retaliatory violence that was just as brutal but far more systematic. They called their retribution the Devil's Wind. Entire villages suspected of sympathizing with rebels were burned to the ground. Summary executions were the norm. Indians were hanged from trees and archways by the dozen. But the signature move, the one designed for maximum terror, was strapping condemned rebels to the mouth of a cannon. Firing the cannon would obliterate the body, a method that was believed to deny a proper burial and thus condemn the soul, according to both Hindu and Muslim beliefs. It was psychological warfare at its most gruesome, carried out by an empire that prided itself on its superior morality. While events like Kanpur defined the rebellion's brutality, other places like Lucknow saw prolonged, grinding warfare with incredible bravery and suffering on both sides. But ultimately, the rebels' lack of central command, modern logistics, and a unified goal doomed them. The British, on the other hand, could draw on the resources of a global empire. Delhi was retaken in September 1857 after a bloody siege. Bahadur Shah Zafar was captured, his sons were executed, and he was exiled to Burma to die. With that, the Mughal dynasty, which had existed for over 300 years, was officially over. And the East India Company, the entity that caused this whole mess with its greed and arrogance, was dissolved. The grand prize for all this bloodshed? India was placed under the direct rule of the British Crown. The rebels fought the company and got the Queen. A spectacular own goal. So, was it a Sepoy mutiny or the First War of Independence? The British used mutiny to frame it as an internal discipline problem. Indian nationalists prefer War of Independence to paint it as a unified, patriotic struggle. Both are wrong. It was a messy, chaotic, multifaceted explosion. It was a military revolt, a series of peasant uprisings against landlords, a religious conflict, and a last gasp of the old princely order, all happening at once. There were heroes and villains on both sides, and most people were just caught in the middle. There were no clean hands, only varying degrees of desperation and brutality. It was a stark reminder that history isn't a simple story of good versus evil. It's usually a story about people making terrible choices under impossible circumstances, a pattern we seem determined to repeat. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!